I believe in an America where the separation of church and state is absolute.
The First Amendment was written not to protect the people and their laws from religious values, but to protect those values from government tyranny.
And I'm tired of this separation of church and state junk that's not in the Constitution.
The separation of church and state is a misnomer. People misunderstand it. Of course, it comes from a phrase that was in a letter that Jefferson wrote. It's not in the Constitution.
Americans are under attack by an extremist, religious, right-wing agenda that has been working for decades to undermine our constitutional rights and erode the separation between church and state.
They say separation between church and state, they told me. I said, all right, let's forget about that for one time.
Was the United States really founded as a Christian nation? What does the Constitution actually say? And what does the separation of church and state even mean? Christianity and the founding of the American Republic. On this episode of History You Can Use. Welcome to History You Can Use. I'm Brian Thomas. Was the United States really founded as a Christian nation? We hear it all the time, and it dominates so many different political discussions these days. But one's answer often is intertwined with their political arguments. If we really want to understand the role of Christianity in the formation of the country, we need to put the political debates aside. So let's do that. Our search for answers begins in the stormy seas of the northern Atlantic Ocean. The year was 1620, and if you were raised in the United States, you probably know this story. A small group of religious outcasts, we'll call them pilgrims, set sail from Europe seeking religious freedom in the New World. Aboard their trusty ship, the Mayflower, the Pilgrims endured a difficult 2-month journey in cold and cramped living conditions and surviving on a meager ration of food. They finally reached land at what is now known as Cape Cod in Massachusetts, where they established the Plymouth colony. But the ensuing winter was brutally cold, food was in short supply, and the very survival of the colony was in question. Nonetheless, they did survive, and the next autumn, they enjoyed a bountiful harvest. To express their gratitude to God for both safe passage across the Atlantic and deliverance from the terrible winter, they feasted for 3 days, welcomed the local Indian tribes, and gave birth to that beloved American holiday, Thanksgiving. The Pilgrims went through so much just for the opportunity to freely practice their version of Christianity. It's an amazing origin story for the United States, lending itself to countless legends and some entertaining stage productions by children. But the Pilgrims weren't alone. 10 years later, Puritans, more formally known as Congregationalists, made the same arduous trip across the ocean and arrived in the same area, establishing the Massachusetts Bay Colony. The Puritans aimed to create a righteous society that would serve as a model for the rest of the Christian world, what their leader John Winthrop described as a city upon the hill. These New England colonies essentially functioned as small theocracies, with the church and colonial government practically inseparable. Church elders doubled as magistrates and legislators and governors, and laws and court decisions were based on their interpretation of the Bible. Historian Patricia Bonomi provided an excellent summary of this relationship between church and state in the early colonies. Quote, "Colonial leaders were concerned above all with creating stable New World communities, and it was an axiom of early 17th century political thought that a strong church was the handmaiden and bulwark of a stable state." End quote. In other words, they believed the church needed to be inseparable from the state because it provided moral direction and encouraged God's protection of the colony. Now let's head a little farther south and jump forward about 50 years. William Penn led his fellow worshipers in the Society of Friends, better known as Quakers, in the establishment of the Pennsylvania colony. Like the Pilgrims and Puritans, Quakers too were escaping persecution, and Pennsylvania was to be their refuge, where they could practice Christianity according to their own beliefs. And just like those colonies in New England, their interpretation of the Bible informed every aspect of the colony they developed. In short, religious freedom, especially the freedom to practice the Christian faith, was a key motivation for colonists in the New World, and the Bible was a foundation of civil law. jumping forward another 50 years, we find the colonies awash in religious fervor. You might remember hearing about the Great Awakening, but what you might not remember is how influential it was to the colonial psyche. Some of the most impassioned preachers history has ever produced fired the souls of the colonists with renewed conviction and Christian piety. Church membership swelled, and people crowded to hear them speak. And these guys were really good. Take, for example, Jonathan Edwards.
It is not unlikely that this work of God's Spirit is a prelude of that glorious work of God, which shall renew the world of mankind. We cannot reasonably think otherwise than that the beginning of this great work of God must be near, and will begin in America.
See what I mean? These weren't your average everyday preachers. The glorious work of God that would renew mankind, referenced by Edwards, was the second coming of Christ. Many Great Awakening preachers ascribe to the view that Christ's return and his establishment of a 1,000-year kingdom on earth, or the millennium, would be the result of human striving for righteousness and take place after a sufficient spread of the Christian faith. And like Edwards, many of the most famous preachers of the era predicted the time of the millennium was near, and the work of bringing it about fell squarely on the shoulders of the North American colonists. You might say the Great Awakening preachers and their followers were the original Christian evangelicals. Even after the zeal of the Great Awakening receded, the idea that America was uniquely chosen by God and tasked with achieving the necessary conditions for Christ's second coming continued to influence the faithful. As the colonies hurtled toward rebellion, millennial beliefs drove many into the patriot cause. Historian Charles Royster poured through countless letters trying to understand the thoughts and emotions of the common soldier. He summarized his findings regarding the spiritual aspects of the Army, quote, as an inspirational expression of hopes shared at least in part by almost all revolutionaries, the millennium pervaded people's understanding of the revolution, end quote. To a greater or lesser extent, soldiers in the American Revolution believed they were fighting for America's unique Christian destiny. This is what today we would call American exceptionalism. On the eve of the American Revolution, the Christian religion, in one form or another, appeared ingrained into the very fabric of colonial society. 9 of the 13 colonies had an official religion, with Congregationalism predominant in New England and the Anglican Church prevailing in the southern colonies and New York. Taxes supported clergy in churches. People were excluded from holding governmental office unless they swore a belief in the established religion, and preaching another faith opened one to criminal prosecution. And yes, that did actually happen. There's a handful of documented cases where Puritan New Englanders executed Quakers for, well, being Quakers. When the Revolution did come, everyone from the farmer serving in the militia to the commanding general of the Continental Army beseeched God for his protection and deliverance. And there was little doubt that the deity invoked by most of the soldiers was the Christian God. Nearly 3 years into the war, Washington reminded his men,
while we are duly performing the duty of good soldiers, we certainly ought not to be inattentive to the higher duties of religion. To the distinguished character of a patriot, it should be our highest glory to add the more distinguished character of a Christian.
Throughout the war, the Continental Congress repeatedly passed proclamations asking the populace to pray and give thanks to God. When victory came, it validated for many the idea that the new nation, the United States, was delivered by divine providence and unique in its duty of bringing about the second coming of Christ. The new country, it seemed, was a land and a people chosen by God. You know, American exceptionalism. There is no doubt that Christianity pervaded the early North American colonies, from their first founding through the end of the Revolution. The influence was both formal, through the official establishment of religion in most colonies, and informal, through a sense of millennial purpose and a righteous destiny. At the core of its identity, the new United States was a Christian nation. So, when it was time to form a government and begin building the country's institutions, it seemed only natural that Christianity formed the foundation of those, right? Well, not exactly. Let's go back to that origin story of the Pilgrims, Puritans, and Quakers fleeing persecution and seeking the freedom to practice their Christian beliefs. Yeah, the truth is a bit more complex. All of those groups fled England because it was the Church of England, or the Anglican Church, that was persecuting them. That's right, a Protestant Christian church was persecuting other Protestant Christians because of differences in theology and practice. It was a persistent fear throughout the colonial era that the Anglican Church might be established as the official religion throughout the North American colonies. Although there's little evidence the Church of England planned to do this, the fear of renewed religious persecution was palpable and created long-standing anxiety of a government-imposed religion. That's actually an important point, and we'll come back to it later. There's also one rather large problem with that origin story. It really only holds for the New England and Pennsylvania colonies. New York, for instance, was founded by the Dutch, and it wasn't for any religious purpose. The civil administration was under the control of the Dutch West India Company, and the primary purpose of the colony was trade, especially fur trading with the local native population. Like New York, the southern colonies were not established for religious reasons. Virginia and the Carolinas were focused on agricultural production. Maryland's charter was originally given to Catholics, but they weren't allowed to establish a Catholic colony for fear of angering Protestants. And Georgia? It was originally conceived as a colony where the destitute in England could pay off debts through indentured servitude, and the mortality rate in the southern colonies was exceptionally high due to disease and starvation and conflicts with native peoples, making the primary goal survival, not Christian piety. The colonial governments in the South were in no position to be picky about their settlers and welcome people from all faiths, including a sizable number of Jews. At one point, there were so many Jewish arrivals in Georgia that a local magistrate actually feared a mass exodus of Protestants. And remember those little theocracies in the North, where church and state were inseparable? Well, they ran into a lot of problems very early. The Puritans in New England, for instance, actively prevented the teaching of conflicting beliefs and banished from their towns those preaching non-congregationalist ideas, like when they executed those Quakers. But as the colonies grew in size, it became increasingly difficult to control who came and went, and it was practically impossible to enforce religious requirements on the populace. Within 10 years of the Puritans' arrival, even the devout followers of the faith were frustrated with the unpredictability of church elders deciding law based on their interpretation of the Bible. As a result, colonial leaders were forced to clearly define the rights of the people and the laws of the colony. The Massachusetts Body of Liberties, as it became known, was the first document in the North American colonies to restrain the power of a colonial government, which, in effect, restrained the power of the church leaders. Pennsylvania, for its part, never excluded non-Quaker ideas from the colony. While Quaker beliefs predominated in the government, William Penn and his followers believed the Bible encouraged a pluralistic society, and from the beginning welcomed Anglicans, German Lutherans, Scots-Irish Presbyterians, and Jews. So successful were their efforts at creating an inclusive and welcoming society that within 20 years of the colony's founding, Quakers were the minority in Pennsylvania. Although they maintained a principal role in the government for the next several decades, the Quaker foundations of the colony were weakened by the weight of an ever-increasing and religiously diverse population. In short, attempts at religious purity in New England and attempts at religious tolerance in Pennsylvania both resulted in challenges to a religiously based government as the population increased. Again, historian Patricia Bonomi best summarized the conclusion of colonial leaders. Quote, "The axiom that a single established church best served the order and stability of the state came under challenge to a greater or lesser degree in all colonies." End quote. By the time of the American Revolution, the integration of state and religion was considered by many to be a failed experiment. It's important to acknowledge the considerable intellectual changes that swept Western civilization during the 18th century. Yes, the Great Awakening promoted religious virtue, but the Enlightenment questioned everything from religious doctrine to the source from which governments draw their power. Empirical observation and especially rational thought, were promoted by the likes of Voltaire and John Locke as the avenues to truth, while the authority of the church was attacked as never before. Literate men and women devoured Enlightenment writings, and many left the Christian church. Take, for example, the most famous man in all the colonies at the outbreak of the Revolution, Benjamin Franklin. There's a lot we could say about Ben. He was an inventor, philosopher, scientist, diplomat, playboy, and lapsed Puritan. Ben's parents were devout Congregationalists and raised him in the church, but he turned away from Christian dogma during his teenage years as he enthusiastically read the works of Enlightenment thinkers. Not only that, Ben went on to be one of the colony's most celebrated Enlightenment luminaries. You know that whole tale about flying a kite in a lightning storm to demonstrate electricity? Yeah, Europeans really loved that story. Another leading colonial intellectual, Thomas Jefferson, also was raised in a Christian household, the Anglican Church to be exact, but he went on to reject many of the fundamental tenets of Christianity, going so far as to take a razor blade to the Bible, cutting out all the parts that reference supernatural elements. Jesus walking on water? Literally didn't make the cut. Raising Lazarus from the dead? Nope. Even Christ's resurrection? Gone. However, this Jefferson Bible left those pieces that detailed Jesus' moral teachings, with which Jefferson generally agreed.
To the corruptions of Christianity I am indeed opposed, but not to the genuine precepts of Jesus himself. I am a Christian, in the only sense he wished anyone to be, sincerely attached to his doctrines in preference to all others.
I know. We made Jefferson sound a little boring, but hey, he was soft-spoken and just not a very good speaker. Anyway, like Jefferson and Franklin, many of those who turned away from the Christian church were nonetheless instilled from their youth with a sense of Christian morality and purpose. It's no secret that Jefferson and many of the other founders were big fans of Christ's moral philosophy, including caring for the less fortunate and treating people with respect. Character and morality were viewed as critical traits for the nation's leaders and the electorate to ensure the success of the new republic. As such, several founders recommended the Bible as a foundational text for the nation's relatively few schools, largely because of its moral lessons, not necessarily to foster a belief in Christ's divinity. Enlightenment principles emphasized rational thought, and rational thought forced Jefferson and others to abandon the belief that events occurring in the world were influenced by the hand of God. However, Enlightenment thinkers failed to offer a suitable explanation for the creation of the world, which could effectively replace the idea of God. As a result, many of the founding fathers of the United States are often considered deists. They believed in a supernatural deity that set the world in motion, and that's about where their religious beliefs ended. Rather than seeing Jesus as the savior of man, deists viewed him as a teacher of natural law, of the world as God created it. Other early influential leaders, like John Adams, also were raised in the church and heavily influenced by its moral teachings, but later leaned toward Unitarianism, or the belief that the Christian God is a single entity, not a trinity, creating a sort of middle ground between deism and Christianity. The Declaration of Independence, primarily authored by Jefferson, with input from Adams and Franklin and a few others, reflects these influences. The Declaration never references Christ or even a specific understanding of God, instead mentioning nature's God, a creator, the supreme judge of the world, and divine providence. No scripture is cited, and a Christian could read the words as relating to the Christian God, the same as a Jew could read it as relating to the Jewish God, or a deist as relating to their own understanding of God. What is unmistakable, though, is the heavy influence of the Enlightenment. When Jefferson writes,
"We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness."
he is clearly nodding to John Locke's argument that the very purpose of government is the protection of life, liberty, and property. Jefferson again borrowed from Locke when he continued,
"To secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed, that whenever any form of government becomes destructive of these ends, it is the right of the people to alter or to abolish it, and to institute new government.
Jefferson here is taking a veiled swipe at the role of religion in government. You see, kings often claim to rule by divine right, which is the belief that they were chosen by God, and the church was a mechanism through which kings controlled the people, arguing instead that governments are instituted among men and derive their power from the consent of the people, inherently meant reducing, if not eliminating, the role of God and the church in government. It was a core Enlightenment ideal that religious tolerance and freedom were necessary in a free society, a principle with which Jefferson wholly agreed. Because of this, most historians reject the idea that the Declaration of Independence was ever intended to exclusively reference the Christian God. Shortly after the beginning of the Revolution, the Continental Congress passed and the states ratified the Articles of Confederation. If you don't recall much about the Articles, that's okay. It wasn't a very successful form of government and it didn't last long. But for our purposes, it's important because it was the first framework of a national government. There's no direct mention of God in the Articles, but there is a reference to the great governor of the world, the writers again choosing a non-specific term. The document provided for a weak federal government, and a multitude of problems between and among the states led to the drafting of a new constitution. But there's a few things to point out before getting to the Constitution. First, several colonies had recognized the Anglican Church as their official religion prior to the Revolution, but, understandably, distanced themselves from the Church of England when the war began, resulting in the majority of states not supporting a specific religion by the time the Constitution was written. Second, while New England states continued to support the Congregationalist Church, the challenges of excluding other religions resulted in the states acknowledging that other churches may be supported, although this was mostly a token gesture. But the most important development for our topic was in Virginia. Soon after writing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson wrote what he called an act for establishing religious freedom, and notes in his journal, quote, "Neither pagan nor Mohammedan nor Jew ought to be excluded from the civil rights of the Commonwealth because of his religion," end quote. That word Mohammedan is just an old-fashioned way of saying Muslim. You heard that right. Almost immediately after writing the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson was concerned about protecting the rights of Jews, Muslims, and what he called pagans. The act itself took aim at any hint of the establishment of a state religion, including requiring citizens to pay taxes to support clergy or churches, as Jefferson believed it coerced people into paying for the promotion of beliefs with which they might disagree, and thus violated their civil and natural rights. He even went so far as to call the practice sinful, tyrannical, bribery, and criminal, and he wrote that right into the act. Ouch. Just so we're clear, that's Thomas Jefferson throwing an 18th century haymaker at his opponents. He was expecting a fight, and he got one. But when the Revolution was over, and it was time to fight legislative battles, Jefferson had a rather large problem. He wasn't around. Shortly after the Revolution was won, Jefferson was appointed the U.S. minister to France, and he left for Paris, where he spent the next 4 years. So, as any good leader does, he delegated, turning the act over to his protege, James Madison, a Virginia state legislator and future 4th President of the United States. Virginia's governor at the time was Patrick Henry. You know him, the fiery and gifted orator who shortly before the Revolution famously declared, "Give me liberty or give me death." Henry had championed a bill that would have levied a tax for supporting what he called teachers of the Christian religion. Henry's bill allowed that each individual taxpayer may choose the Christian denomination that would receive his monies, but only Christian faiths qualified for taxpayer support. Madison led the charge against Henry's proposal, writing a widely circulated petition called a Memorial and Remonstrance, where he argued, quote, "Religion must be left to the conviction and conscience of every man," end quote. Madison's case was persuasive and effectively killed Henry's bill. After its defeat, the time had come for Madison to introduce Jefferson's Act for Establishing Religious Freedom. Now it was Henry's turn to play the role of spoiler. Both sides unleashed their partisan forces and letters poured into Richmond from across the Commonwealth. In the end, the legislature approved Madison and Jefferson's proposal. Henry was down for the count. He decided not to serve another term and left the governorship a month later. Jefferson viewed the passage of the bill as one of his proudest accomplishments in public life, later saying in his autobiography that the act was meant to protect, quote, the Jew, the Gentile, the Christian, the Mohammedan, the Hindu, and infidel of every denomination, end quote. Madison, for his part, didn't stay in Virginia for long. The Virginia Resolution for Religious Freedom, as it was called in its final form, passed in October 1786. A few months later, Madison led the Virginia delegation to the newly assembled Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia. Madison was a central figure in Philadelphia, and he was the primary architect of what became known as the Virginia Plan. It proposed a federal government with 3 branches, 2 houses in the legislative branch, and representation in the legislature based on state population. If that sounds just a little familiar, it's because the Virginia Plan largely served as the framework for the Constitution itself, and his efforts earned Madison the nickname Father of the Constitution. Unlike the Declaration of Independence and the Articles of Confederation, there is no explicit reference in the Constitution to any religious deity. In fact, the only place religion is even mentioned in the original document is in Article 6, a phrase introduced by Charles Pinckney of South Carolina, which reads, quote, no religious test shall ever be required as a qualification to any office or public trust under the United States. The ratification of the Constitution was far from certain. Madison joined with Alexander Hamilton and John Jay to author a series of newspaper articles designed to drum up popular support for the proposed form of government. Collectively, these articles are referred to as the Federalist Papers, and they give incredible insight into the thoughts of the original framers of the Constitution. Over the course of 85 articles, arguing for everything from the 3-branch structure of the government to the need for checks and balances, the 3 men rarely ever discussed the topic of religion. In Federalist Paper number 51, Madison alluded to religious rights when he said,
in a free government, the security for civil rights must be the same as that for religious rights. It consists in the one case in the multiplicity of interests, and in the other in the multiplicity of sects.
Madison's larger argument here is that the government must not be allowed to violate the civil and religious rights of individuals, and he was mainly concerned that a government of the majority might trample the rights of the minority. Dispersing the power of the federal government across different branches that all include a diversity of perspectives was the best safeguard against that happening. President Ronald Reagan, who you heard in our opening, was correct. A goal of the Constitution was to protect individual rights, including religious rights, from what Reagan called government tyranny. But why would a government designed to create a free society ever want to violate an individual's religious rights? How would that even happen? Well, Madison had thoughts. In perhaps the most famous of the Federalist Papers, number 10, he wrote,
a religious sect may degenerate into a political faction in a part of the Confederacy, but the variety of sects dispersed over the entire face of it must secure the national councils against any danger from that source.
Madison was warning against a particular religious group becoming an organized political force and holding too much power, which would allow for the persecution of religious minorities. Remember I said we'd come back to that fear of the Church of England being established throughout the colonies? Here it is. The Pilgrims, Puritans, and Quakers fled England because they were being persecuted by an organized, established church, and Madison had no desire to see that situation repeat itself in the United States. Also, religious persecution was ongoing in Catholic France and Catholic Spain at the time the Constitution was written. There was a significant fear that religious intolerance would undermine the free society the founders sought to create. This is the part that President Reagan left out. A government based on a particular religion was viewed by the founders as the most significant threat to religious freedom. Today, we might talk about fascist or communist governments threatening religious freedoms, but those concepts didn't really exist in the 18th century. And, if we're being honest, the only religious force that could take over the government in the United States in 1788 was Christianity, or some specific Christian denomination. In other words, one could easily read Madison's comments as promoting religious diversity in order to prevent a Christian takeover of the government. It's also worth noting that Madison, in Federalist Paper number 52, referenced the Pinckney Clause forbidding a religious test for holding office. It's only mentioned in passing to note that individuals may be elected to the House of Representatives without consideration of various personal characteristics. The reason this clause didn't get more attention by the writers of the Federalist Papers is that it wasn't particularly controversial or even debated within the Constitutional Convention. However, it was the subject of debate once the document reached the states for ratification. Some feared the clause may result in Catholics or Jews or Muslims holding offices in the new government, while others countered that religious tests had formed the basis for persecution throughout history. In the end, the Constitution was ratified by the requisite number of states, with the Pinckney Clause included. One of the initial tasks of the First Congress in 1789 was the drafting of amendments to the Constitution that enumerated the rights of citizens, thereby restraining the federal government. Again, it was James Madison in the lead, this time as an elected representative from Virginia. Only a few years removed from his successful defense of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, Madison brought the intention and effect of that document to the national discussion, choosing his words carefully so as not to alienate the New England states, who still recognized Congregationalism as their established religion. He wrote the opening line of the First Amendment, commonly known as the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses.
Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof.
The Bill of Rights was ratified about 2 years later. The primary opposition came from the likes of Alexander Hamilton, who opposed placing more restrictions on the federal government, but little debate focused on any one specific amendment. However, there is evidence from the same time period that gives us a greater insight into the intended meaning of the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses. Less than 5 years after the Bill of Rights was ratified, the United States entered a treaty with the Muslim states in North Africa, designed to put an end to attacks on U.S. shipping by the Barbary pirates. In the Treaty of Tripoli, it is clearly stated, quote, "The government of the United States of America is not in any sense founded on the Christian religion." End quote. The purpose of the clause was to clarify that no pretext existed that should result in religious conflict between the U.S. and the Muslim states. President John Adams signed the treaty after it was unanimously ratified by the Senate. A few years later, President Thomas Jefferson received a letter from a group of Baptists in Danbury, Connecticut, wanting to know his position on religious matters. In what is often referred to as the Danbury Letter, Jefferson responded in a now famous manner.
Religion is a matter which lies solely between man and his God. I contemplate with sovereign reverence that act of the whole American people, which declare that their legislature should make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof, thus building a wall of separation between church and state.
This is the letter that Speaker of the House Mike Johnson referenced in our opening, and Speaker Johnson is correct. The term separation of church and state never actually appears in the Constitution. But remembering that Jefferson wrote the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom, which served as the foundation of the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses of the First Amendment, and he was the mentor, ally, and confidant of James Madison, who actually wrote the First Amendment, Jefferson is a pretty reliable source to speak on its meaning. Years later, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling where it cited the Danbury Letter and said that Jefferson's metaphor of a wall of separation between church and state, quote, may be accepted as an authoritative declaration of the scope and effect of the First Amendment, end quote. Ever since, the separation of church and state has become a shorthand way of referring to the Establishment and Free Exercise Clauses. There were critics of the separation of church and state at each step in the process, but those who championed an overtly Christian recognition in the founding documents Lost. The Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom succeeded over Henry's objections. Adams's Secretary of War, James McHenry, later said he objected to the clause in the Treaty of Tripoli stating that the U.S. was not founded on the Christian religion, but the treaty was unanimously ratified and signed by the president anyway. The Constitution, including the Pinckney Clause preventing a religious test to hold office, was ratified in all 13 states over objections. Even Hamilton, who objected to the Bill of Rights because it restrained the federal government, lost. Those advocating for a clear separation of church and state won every significant battle along the way, keeping overtly Christian language and sanctioning out of the founding documents. Of the 39 signers of the Constitution, it's been argued that as many as 37 were Christians. The implication is that Christianity in some way formed the foundation of the document. Although that number is almost certainly inaccurate, the people who make that argument usually leave out most of the context. For instance, many of those signers who were professed and devout Christians didn't have much of a role in drafting the document. If I recited their names, you probably wouldn't recognize most of them. Their role was, at best, minor. Also, these arguments leave out important details. For instance, at one point, when the negotiations seemed to be at a standstill, Benjamin Franklin recommended that the delegates pray. And I know what you're thinking. That seems like a strange thing for a deist, right? But not really. In his older years, Franklin had edged closer to the belief that a supreme being was asserting some limited influence in the events of the world, whatever or whoever that God might be. He still wasn't a Christian, but he knew some of his colleagues were. So, whatever their understanding of God, Christian or deist, what harm could prayer do? Well, the delegates actually declined Franklin's idea, prompting Ben to record in his notes, quote, "The convention, except for 3 or 4 persons, thought prayers unnecessary," end quote. So surprised was Ben, he ended that statement with an exclamation point. In short, there's just no convincing evidence that the framers of the Constitution, as a group, believed they were being guided by the hand of the Christian God. Lastly, it's difficult to say what many of the Founding Fathers actually believed about religion. Unlike today, most of the prominent political figures of the time, including many signers of the Constitution, did not publicly discuss religious matters, and when they did, it's often unclear whether they were endorsing a religious belief in Christ as the Messiah or only promoting the moral teachings of Jesus. For example, remember that quote earlier from General Washington, urging his men to display the character of a Christian? Well, George was encouraging his men to be compassionate and show restraint when interacting with loyalist civilians. Based on his more personal writings, most historians believe George was probably a deist or maybe a Unitarian, although he often accompanied his devout wife Martha to Episcopalian services. John Adams and James Madison were likely Unitarians during the early years of the Republic, and Jefferson was almost certainly a deist, although all of them held Jesus' teachings in high regard and frequently referenced God, if not Christ. Alexander Hamilton fluctuated in his religious beliefs, but returned to his Episcopalian faith later in life. Nonetheless, Hamilton too believed that the government should not give preference to any one religion. And that brings up one final issue. Personal religious beliefs did not necessarily translate into political philosophy. Jefferson and Madison clearly believed in a complete separation of church and state, although they often mentioned God in their correspondence, while John Adams publicly sang the praises of Christian morality, and at the same time despised the idea of organized religion. In short, it's difficult to interpret the religious beliefs of many of the founding generation from the brief glances we have available in their writings, and it's even more difficult to argue that those beliefs impacted their views on government. So, was the United States founded as a Christian nation? It depends on what that question means. Certainly, there is a wealth of evidence that Christianity was a central aspect of the American identity during the colonial era and at the time the country was founded. Christianity influenced the moral beliefs of the common man, as well as the political and intellectual leaders of the time, including men like Jefferson and Franklin, who certainly did not consider themselves Christians. It's true, the moral teachings of the Bible were viewed by many as a guidepost to the development of the country's character. In this manner, Christianity can rightly be said to have formed the moral basis of the country. However, if that question is asking whether the founding documents of the country intended for the United States to be an overtly Christian nation, then the evidence goes in another direction. Long-standing fears of a government that might persecute religious minorities, including minority Christian denominations, led even those professing a Christian faith to oppose the entanglement of church and state. The First Amendment was designed to prevent the government from intruding on the religious beliefs of the individual. But the founders believed that was most likely to occur when a particular religion became a dominant force in the government. And Jefferson's explicit acknowledgement of the rights of Muslims, Jews, and Hindus, the success of the Virginia Statute for Religious Freedom and its foundational role in the establishment and free exercise clauses, even the Treaty of Tripoli, all argue against the idea that the founders restricted their concerns only to the free exercise of the Christian religion. Starting with the Declaration of Independence and moving forward through the Danbury Letter, the documentary evidence leaves little doubt that the First Amendment, as written by Madison, heavily influenced by Jefferson, and certified by Congress and the states, was meant to disestablish religion from the government. So what do you think? Was the United States founded as a Christian nation? How you frame that question and its answer is up to you. But now you know the complexity of the issues surrounding that question, and that's history you can use. History You Can Use is produced and hosted by me, Brian Thomas, with the assistance of various historians. Music and sound editing by Beeger Sound Design. If you think there's something we didn't get quite right, send us a message at mail@historyyoucanuse.com. Be sure to include your first name and where you're writing from, because we might just use your message in a future Talkback episode. Have a suggestion for a future episode topic? You can drop us an email for that too. Visit our website, historyyoucanuse.com, to access additional content and to join our mailing list. And be sure to follow us on our socials and join the conversation. See you next time.